Hello, I'm Bryan Caplan, and I am here today to do a podcast with the best philosopher, Michael Huemer, about his new book, Progressive Myths. I've already written a piece praising this book. So there's at least two copies in the world. Already written a piece praising this book. I say this is the best book on wokeness. This is a strange new political religion that emerged in the last 10 to 15 years. I really didn't see it coming. I'm not sure if Mike did either, but in any case, now we have the book explaining its numerous intellectual flaws.
Yeah,
So why don't we just get into it?
yeah.
All right. So in your book, you have very early on, you have a distinction between neutral versus objective presentations.
Yes.
And if I can go and quote your words, I doubt you'll mind. Quote, I will not give a neutral presentation in the following chapters, but I do aim to give an objective presentation. I'm a philosopher, not a lawyer or a campaign manager. My task is not to replace left wing propaganda with right wing propaganda. My task is to replace propaganda with a fair and accurate account. All right. So, tell us more. What is this
Yeah.
strange idea about something other than propaganda?
Yeah. Well, yeah. So, a neutral presentation would mean I don't take a stand on the issues, right?
Uh huh.
And so, I don't want to do that. What's the point of that? An objective presentation means, well, like you give a fair account of the issue. So, like, I attempt to give a fair account of why people think something and of what the actual facts about that thing are. And it happens that in the 20 chapters, a fair account that takes into account the evidence on both sides results in one side being wrong. Like, you can, like, if one side is objectively wrong, then an objective presentation will say that they're wrong. An objective presentation will not say, that, both sides are equally good.
So one idea that I'm associated with is the ideological Turing test, where you try to go and explain a view that you disagree with so well that a person cannot tell whether or not you actually hold that view. Or
Yeah.
really, the gold standard is if a person who agrees with the view says that you have correctly stated their position in a double blind setting where they don't really know, but all they get to do is hear what you have to say. Are you aspiring to this? Do you think that you could actually get someone who is very woke to say, while I disagree with the assessment, Huemer has accurately described our position? Or what do you think you achieved in terms
Well,
of the fairness of your presentation?
yeah, I didn't think about that per se, but I guess I would be unhappy if the woke people thought that my presentation of the myths was not something that any of them
Mm-hmm.
believed, right? Although I suspect that, if you ask them, they might not answer honestly. So, okay, so, there's like in the chapters that each chapter will say, here's a myth, and then it would state something, and it's supposed to state what people actually think is true. And
Mm-hmm.
then I would give quotations that are supposed to indicate that
Yes,
people
yes.
actually believe that. And so if you read that, I think almost everyone will say, yes, what I described as a myth is in fact what these people are saying in these
Mm-hmm.
quotes.
Mm-hmm.
However, I think people might be able to figure out that I'm against it,
Mm-hmm.
just like from the fact that I picked extreme things
Mm-hmm.
like that people are saying.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So
Yeah, but so you did make an effort to get actual quotes from people to say this is not just some view that I made up. I mean,
yeah.
like this does remind me of that pretty well-known piece by Freddie DeBoer. The title is roughly like, "Please tell me the name I am allowed to use for the incredible body of radical social changes you advocate." The point
Yeah.
being that like a lot of people who are woke don't like the word woke. We say, okay, what is the word that I can use? And it's often hard just to get an answer to that. It's sort of like
Yeah.
we don't really want to tell you what it is that we're even talking about. We just want you to know there's a long
Well,
list of really controversial views that nobody believed prior to 20 years ago. And now you're all expected to know this is the only thing you're allowed to believe. Or
yeah.
perhaps I'm uncharitable. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think basically what happened was, the woke people. So I refer to it as
Mm-hmm.
progressivism, but and wokeism is like a subset of that, okay?
Okay.
But basically what happened was the woke people made up the word woke for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
as like, unironically describing themselves as like being more awake than other people are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but then it came to have negative associations, but it's not because it's a slur. It's not because like,
Mm-hmm.
somebody made up a unfair word to tar them with. It's because people came to understand what that refers to, and almost everyone disagrees with it. Right? And so like
Mm-hmm.
there's no point in coming up with a different word for it. If you come
Mm-hmm.
up with a different word for it, as soon as people understand what it means, then they're going to have
Mm-hmm.
negative reactions to it.
Yeah, there's this idea in linguistics of the semantic treadmill where the thing itself has a negative connotation, then any word that you adopt will quickly acquire the connotation.
Yeah, yeah. Or like, an
Mm-hmm.
example is that the word mentally retarded it's a euphemism.
Mm-hmm.
And like it was
Yeah.
created as a euphemism for stupid because it
Yes.
sounded insulting to say that these people were really stupid. So, okay, but then because retarded just means like held back or slowed down or something like that. So it was kind of a nicer way to put it. But now it's
Yes.
even more derogatory.
Yeah. All right. Now, the way you began this book really surprised me, and it was you very quickly went into a bunch of current events. And like when I was reading it, my first reaction was, was this: most philosophers stop being philosophers when they discuss current events. You know a lot more philosophers than I do, so you know better than I do if that's actually true. But just starting off, so do you agree in your experience? Do most philosophers just forget philosophy when current events come up and start sounding like normal people, or what do they even do?
Yeah, I guess that's true. Yeah. I mean, but
I guess I would guess it's on a continuum from 0 to 100%. So
yes.
maybe a number like 100% being they are totally detached from their society and only philosophic truth matters, and 0% is they just naively repeat whatever they hear in the media. Where is the typical academic philosopher on
Oh,
that 0 to 100
well,
continuum?
I'm not sure. Like,
Well, of course not. But
it's
if you had to guess,
it's
where,
like,
give me a number.
wait, so
100 is they are the ideal philosopher, and
oh
0
yeah,
is
it's
they are all too human.
I guess I would say it's under 50,
Under
right?
50.
No, that it might be
Okay.
under 25. But I mean, it's a little bit odd because so when you talk about current events, like usually philosophical issues are not relevant. So
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, what, but I can fill in what you mean by being a
Yeah.
philosopher, right? I mean, you mean like sort of like thinking critically about it instead
Mm-hmm.
of um
Yeah, because I would
yeah.
think that philosophy is almost always relevant to current events. I'm a little surprised you say that.
Well, I mean, in the sense that it's relevant to everything, right? But
Yeah,
like
yeah. Well, and
but
it's controversial, and humans care about it, and their emotions are running over full.
yeah, yeah. Well, what I mean is like what we think of as philosophical issues is generally more abstract and general
Mm-hmm.
things. So
Yeah.
like, because a lot of these issues are things that say in 20 years nobody's going to know what the hell I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And philosophical issues we generally think of as these things that people have been talking about for centuries and like, um,
Or even just the epistemic point that you made in one of my favorite thought experiments of yours, where it's like, look, the very fact that you're covering certain issues on the news is a very thinly veiled way to say these are really important compared to other things we're talking about. And yet you watch and like, why is this the important stuff?
yeah,
And
yeah,
just for a philosopher to uncritically even let the issues that are important to discuss be determined by this corrupt process
yeah, yeah.
seems terrible.
I mean, like another reason why it's hard to answer your question is that you you might be presuming that philosophers on other issues are more rational than they are,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, I mean,
So,
I don't think I am, but perhaps I am. There's a
but
background assumption that they would, and then the realization that they aren't is horrifying.
well, yeah, yeah, but so like it's extremely common for philosophers to be ignorant of empirical facts.
Mm-hmm.
Like so like the advantage of philosophers is that we're less confused than people in other fields. But our disadvantage is that we usually do not know the facts.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just sort of like armchair speculate or whatever. And like that's a stereotype, but the stereotype has a basis in reality. Okay, so
All
like
right.
what we do about politics is we do that. Right? And you do that a lot. We just sort of like, and often like the philosophers will just like guess. They'll assume that the empirical facts are what their friends say, and their friends are leftists. So they'll just like assume the empirical facts are what the leftists say.
Well, I mean, the friends are highly educated leftists too, so it's
Yeah.
not as bad as it might be just for everybody to assume that whatever their friends think is true. But All
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So now this thing on current events, it leads into my first big question. So what do you differently, what do you do differently in part one with regard to current events? And how can other philosophers emulate you?
Yeah, well, what I do differently from most people is I try to find out what actually happened.
All right. Step one,
So,
anyway.
yeah, so, okay, yeah, so Trayvon Martin, famous case, right? Um, I gather that a bunch of people think that he was murdered, and I decided to find out what actually happened. Like, was he murdered? What did he do? And so, you just like um, look up the case,
So, like Wikipedia would be good enough.
Um, Sadly not, right?
Wikipedia
It's
is
like,
not good
like
enough.
usually if there's a court case, you can get documents in the court case, or you could just like
Okay.
find out what the police investigation found out or something like that. Okay. And then, in that case, you get like, well, I found out stuff about like what the medical examiner found out, right? Like, like there was this testimony that happened in the trial that um when the gun was George Zimmerman had this fight with Trayvon Martin, Trayvon
Mm-hmm.
being the black guy. Okay, and so then the in the trial, one of the forensic experts testified that when the gun was fired, when George shot Trayvon, the gun was in contact with Trayvon's shirt, but not with his skin, like a couple of inches away from his skin
Mm-hmm.
or something like that. That means that the shirt was hanging away from his body. That
Okay.
means that Trayvon was on top of George. Right. And it was, so you could just get things like that. And that was not reported in mainstream media reports. And then there's just like a bunch of stuff that's like that, right? They would just like not report the stuff that doesn't go with the narrative that they want.
Hmm. So you did a bunch of individual cases, but the one I was most intrigued by was the Rittenhouse case. Could you give us a philosophical summary of the Rittenhouse case?
Well, what do you mean by philosophical? Like, like,
Well,
should I,
so like the nature of self-defense, what would count as
yeah,
self-defense, what happened
yeah,
relative to that,
yeah, good.
things like, well, he came from out of state, so self-defense doesn't apply.
Yeah.
Like that kind of thing, that philosophical summary of the case.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah. So like some people were saying, they're just like all of these people in the media are saying, he drove across state lines, he crossed state line. You're like, okay, it's not illegal to cross state lines in America. Actually, that's kind of like a right that people have. And like the fact that somebody and they were trying to make it sound like he had gone a long distance and he had no business there.
mhm.
That is not the case. He lived right near the border and he regularly drove across that border to go to work, right? Because he
Ah,
worked there and he had family members who lived
mhm,
there. So it's actually not going a long way out of his distance. Not that it would be wrong to go a long way out of your distance. Right? Like it's also okay to travel a
mhm,
long distance,
mhm,
but he didn't. Okay, but okay, and then he winds up shooting these three people, I guess.
mhm,
And then okay, so but and then like one of the quotations I think was basically saying, well, like how could he be found not guilty when we saw him shoot those people? Like there's video of him shooting those people. Yes. Nobody disputed whether he shot them actually. But you are allowed to shoot somebody if they are posing a serious physical threat to your safety, right? And like if the
mhm,
other person is physically attacking you, and that's what the evidence showed from the trial, that these people
mhm,
were attacking you. Okay, and then there's like, the prosecutor in the trial at one point said, "Oh, well, sometimes you have to take a beating." Right? Meaning that like you can't shoot somebody just to prevent getting beaten. But the thing is, well, so there would be a philosophical issue about like how much harm
mhm.
are you allowed to avert by killing somebody? Like how serious does the harm have to
Yeah, if
be?
they were going to flick your ear, is it okay to kill them?
Yeah, so no. Right, yeah. Okay, but this case was not a borderline case.
Mhm,
Okay, because like if there's a mob of people, a rampaging, enraged mob coming down the street towards you, and like the three people at the head of the mob are there, and one of them bashes you in the back of the head with a skateboard, and the other one kicks you in the head, like jump kicks you,
mhm,
and then the third one is holding a handgun and approaching you with it. No, you cannot just decide to take a
mhm,
beating. Like you're going to be dead. Like he had to stop the attack immediately, or he would just be overwhelmed, right? And like those three people would probably seriously injure him. But then the mob, like he should expect to be possibly killed in the next few seconds
Hmm.
if he doesn't stop it. So it's like it was
Hmm.
not an unclear case. If you look
Hmm.
at the facts of the case, it
Hmm.
just isn't, it's not hard at all.
So now here's a question where I deliberately didn't check what the answer was before I asked you so that I could get your version of it. So I'm going
Yeah.
to call this a deliberately uninformed question, intentionally uninformed. So I just heard that Rittenhouse was friends with Nazis or maybe a Nazi himself. What is the truth of the matter here?
Um, I don't I don't think that's true. Well, so there was a photograph taken of him hanging out with people in a bar who
Hmm.
apparently were Proud Boys. And this
Okay.
is the Proud Boys is a far right, I guess it's fair to call them a right-wing extremist organization.
Hmm.
Um, some people call them white supremacists. They explicitly deny that they're white supremacists. I'm inclined to believe them because they actually had a chairman who was Afro-Cuban. He's half
Hmm.
black, half Cuban.
Hmm.
So I don't think a white supremacist organization would have that. They also used to have like statements explicitly denouncing racism on their website before their website was taken down, or
All
something like
right.
that. So, but it is fair to say right-wing extremists. Okay. So he was hanging out with these people in a bar, and then there's a photograph of him with a couple of these guys. Apparently, like we're told, these are Proud Boys, and there's a photograph of Rittenhouse holding up the OK sign,
Uh-huh.
getting a photograph taken of him. Okay, and now apparently that is now considered like a white supremacist symbol, the OK
Hmm.
symbol, with like with
Hmm.
the ring and the three fingers. Which apparently that idea started up with trolls on 4chan. 4chan or Reddit, in one of these. And so some trolls on the internet made up the idea that that's a sign of white supremacy. But then apparently some white supremacist organizations have now adopted it. So it actually is okay. But Rittenhouse said that he just thought that was the okay symbol.
Hmm.
Right.
So, not great evidence that he was even friends with Nazis, much less is in fact a Nazi.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
It's very, very dubious. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So those are you got a bunch of chapters on individual cases. Now moving on to bigger questions. So, what are the basic facts about police shootings in America?
Yeah, the police kill something like 1,000 to 1,100 people per year,
Hmm.
usually by shooting them. So,
Hmm.
frequently people just say police shootings, but they usually mean police homicides in general. A few hundred of them will be unarmed, I
Hmm.
think.
A few hundred? So,
Um,
sounds way too high. So, thought Washington Post was something like 15 to 20 blacks per year, and then probably the general population would about double that.
Uh, actually, now, so now I'm not sure. It might be around 100. But so in the year that I looked at,
Okay.
there were a total of 36 unarmed black people who'd been killed by police,
Hmm.
and then there'd be some larger number of white people, and
Hmm.
there's like a really tiny number of Asians, and then
Hmm.
there'll be a few Hispanics. But so, okay, but there was a source that talked about this that reported the number of unarmed black people as being something like 8. But basically, it turned out that it was an incomplete database, and then
Okay.
when they updated the database later, it came up to 36.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, okay, so it's really rare to be shot by the police while unarmed, and there are other things you can do. Like while being unarmed, there are still things you can do that would make you dangerous enough that it might make sense to shoot you. Like
Hmm.
if you're attempting to take the gun from the cops, you don't have a gun yet.
Right.
You're trying to take the cop's
Hmm.
gun.
So that would get coded as an unarmed person being shot if
I
they,
think that's right.
yeah,
Yeah.
if they actually got touched the gun, then are they unarmed?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
When
I'm
did
not
another
sure
film,
exactly right, but
little ship of Theseus,
yeah, yeah.
the
But
Sorates
oh, and
paradox kind of
by the
thing?
way, armed people, it includes being armed with a car. So
Uh-huh.
some of the cases of people who were armed and were shot were people who were trying to run over the cop or were
Hmm.
trying to
Hmm.
crash into their car
Hmm.
or something like that.
Hmm.
Okay, but basically, it is quite rare for you to be killed while you're not doing anything. Um, okay, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all these homicides are justified. Like it could still be that they could have diffused the situation, even though the person is doing something threatening.
Hmm.
Okay, and I think in other countries, the police are there are fewer homicides per unit of population in other countries. And I think that's mostly because the police usually are able to de-escalate without
It's not
violence.
just lower rates of criminality in general in other countries.
So I'm not totally sure. Well, so it's partly that it might be that police are more afraid in America because there are more
Mhm.
guns in America.
Right.
So like we have the highest gun ownership rate in America.
Mhm.
Now, the police are
Or just
not
higher. I mean, presumably it would be high murder rates that would scare cops. Switzerland can have high gun ownership, but since they're rarely used for murders, I bet the Swiss cops are not scared.
yes,
Yeah,
right. Yeah.
you could be armed to the teeth, but if no one ever kills anybody, then you presumably wouldn't be very frightened. Whereas
Yeah, yeah.
if there were no guns, but people are very commonly used edge weapons, then you would be scared. I would think.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That's
Yeah,
probably right. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, so I think there might be some misperception going on. Like I think police are aware of the relatively rare case of
Mm-hmm.
police being shot. So
Mm-hmm.
the cops might be overestimating the danger that they're in.
Mm-hmm.
The chance of a police officer being murdered is actually less than the chance of a member of the general population being murdered.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not sure the police actually know that.
Mm-hmm.
So they might think that they're in more danger than they are, and then that might, result in
Mm-hmm.
more violent reactions.
All right. So this is again a question. You may think of it as not philosophical, but to me it is. So, what are the adjustments that you would need to make to the raw numbers in order to even know if police shootings are racist?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what you should do is sort of look at the other explanation. So, like, what happens is the black people are something like an eighth of the population, but they're something like a quarter of the police shooting victims.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one possible explanation of that is the police are racist, they hate cops, and they like to kill them. Sorry,
Or
they hate blacks,
yeah,
and so they like
yes,
to kill them.
yes.
Okay, um, um, but you should at minimum about alternative explanations.
Mm-hmm.
Like, maybe there are more cases of black people attacking police officers. Right, at a minimum, you should try to control for that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then, and you should try to control for other factors. I'm not sure what the other factors would be because I didn't think beyond that because that factor is enough to explain it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it turns out that black people are also 43% of the cop killers in America. So,
So, in a way, sort of one of my views of what wokeness is it's the kind of philosophy that says you shouldn't make these adjustments because the very fact that you're even trying is in a way racist. It's like the very fact that we have a society where blacks wind up being more criminals itself like a sign of a racist society. So, sort of this non-falsifiable way of calling all problems racist. Is
yeah,
that
yeah.
something that you encountered in writing the book or that you're responding to, or am I off base?
Well, it really does. Yeah, it seems that way. And so it seems like the woke people place the question, is it racist, before the question, how is the world?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the reality?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So like, okay, we decided that it's racist to say that black people commit more crimes than white people. Because that's racist, now we can't say that. So now we have to think of something else to say, right? Or we have to like somehow make it the fault of white people
Mm-hmm.
that there are
Yeah, the
higher
latter is what I'm
crimes.
thinking of more. So, you can imagine saying, look, the very fact that the police have not done what it takes in order to get black crime rates down to the crime rates of the rest of the population is itself racism. Sort of a very strong positive duty to have solved social problems that's in the background, such that it doesn't really matter what the facts are. It's just going to determine the kind of racism rather than whether or
Yeah.
not it's racism.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're right to point out that it's unfalsifiable, right? And like if you're sort of thinking in good faith, you should think about like, well, what would the world be like if I was wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And like, is there like a logically possible world in which
Mm-hmm.
it's not the fault of white people? Like,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, why are white people the only people who could have agency? And if you acknowledge the possibility that black people could have agency, right? Which, by the way, like the fact that they don't acknowledge the agency of black people is actually kind of racist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like what something is going bad, it has to be white people did it because what? White people are the only ones who can do anything. So anyway,
Yeah. All right. So here's a question. So you have another book, Justice Before the Law. I'm a big fan. Did you know these facts about police shootings when you wrote the book?
so I don't totally remember what I knew, but
Or another
I
way of flipping it around is there anything that you learned while writing progressive myths that makes you see actually existing policing in a different light?
um well, so I read more about particular cases, which gives you more of a sense of just like what the world is like and how things go. So when I wrote Justice Before the Law, I did like mention that, sometimes the police abuse people and like sometimes they will kill people unnecessarily. And I still think that's true. I still think that police are killing more people than they have to.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think, and I never thought that it was because of race. I just think American police are more aggressive than police in other
Mm-hmm.
countries.
Mm-hmm.
However, like reading some of these cases, man, you, so in some of these cases, you just think, man, they had no choice.
Mm-hmm.
This criminal is just not giving them any other choice.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's kind of like the Michael Brown case, where and like it appears that what happened was, Michael Brown, he just started punching this cop, and it was just like, beating him through the window, and then he runs away. Okay, but then he turns around and comes back and charges the cop, and like, what is the cop supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, I sort of like, I mean, sort of emotionally, I got more sympathy for the police that they have to
Mm-hmm.
deal with these criminals all the time.
Right. So economists are very fond of this distinction between type 1 and type 2 error. It's one of the strangest distinctions because we never remember which one type 1 and type 2 is, but
Yeah,
it comes down to the only way to be sure you never kill an innocent person is to never kill anyone for any reason. And the only way to be sure that nothing bad ever happens is to kill everybody immediately. And then in the real world, you're striking some balance between these two extreme cases. So, I
yeah,
mean, this is one where, especially in the case of self-defense, when you're talking about second guessing someone, it's like, well, look, the attacker put a person often with no prior experience with being in mortal danger in a situation where they're afraid for their lives. And then it's like, well, all right, so maybe they overreacted, but like it's the fault of the attacker that a person with no experience has to make a life or death decision in the course of 5 seconds. So yeah,
yeah, no,
my view is like
yeah,
self defense should be much more expansive and always with the background of this is an inexperienced person who was never in the situation before, and it's
yeah, yeah.
not their fault that they were put in this situation, and they just didn't have time to deliberate.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, so that would not apply to the case of the
Yes.
cops being attacked, but that might
Well,
apply
although,
to,
given how rarely cops actually draw their weapons, it's actually not quite as clear cut. Like, you remember
yeah,
the story of, I guess it was the cops at Sandy Hook who didn't go into the school to go and save the kids.
yeah,
And people were really upset at them. And they kind of think, well, like, these guys may have never shot at anybody in their whole lives. And now it's like action hero time. It's a little, like on the one hand, you say you are paid to deal with the worst
yeah,
case scenario, which probably will never arise in 1,000 years of policing. But this is not your day, dude, and you signed up for this. But it's
yeah, yeah.
not like they have a lot of experience with these situations, actually.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, they got some training in simulators, but it might be different because
Yeah,
like
I would think so.
yeah, yeah,
I mean,
in
I've
real
been
life.
in like a first person shooter simulator. I don't think I'm going to do well in the real situation.
Sorry, you cut
Yeah.
out for a second there, so I didn't hear all of that. But
Let's see.
um,
I think it will be okay. All right. All
so
right.
right,
So
but but your point would apply maybe to the Kyle Rittenhouse case. I was actually very impressed with him, right? That actually, let's say, even though he was under a lot of pressure, and like this guy is not he's not a soldier or a cop or anything like that. He actually did exactly the right thing. Like he didn't shoot anyone unnecessarily. There's a moment in trial where they're talking about so the one guy that he shot who survived, like the guy was just shot in the arm. But like if you freeze frame it, like you can see that the time that Rittenhouse shoots is the time that that guy is pointing his pistol at Rittenhouse.
hmm,
So he did not have not have like a fraction of a second more. Right.
wow.
And then, there's a time when the guy like holds his hands up and Rittenhouse doesn't shoot. And then the guy starts to move forward and he starts to bring the gun down. And then Rittenhouse shoots him in the arm. So like that kid was lucky. And he
Yeah.
was like just like performed very well under
Hmm.
extreme pressure where I would not have performed so
All right. So moving on, but this book is packed with stuff. All right.
well.
So what do we really know about the prevalence of rape, sexual assault, and false accusations thereof?
Yeah, we don't really know. Like there's a problem that rape is underreported. I think this is widely recognized.
Mhm.
I don't think that's in dispute. It's underreported, but it's also overreported. Right. So how could that be? Well, basically, like a lot of times, if somebody suffers rape, they probably will not report it.
Mhm.
And we know this because even in the National Crime Victimization Survey, which the government does every year, they get a bunch of cases of people who report crimes and particularly report rapes that they say they did not report to the police.
Mhm.
Okay, but also some
They
people
report to
who
the
were not,
surveyor. They report to the
what?
survey. They report to the surveyor, but not to the
But
police.
not, yeah, that's right, yeah. But then there are also cases where people were not raped and they report that they were. So
Mhm.
it could be both underreported and overreported.
Mhm.
Um, now, yeah, do we know? So there's a statistic that sometimes goes around where people say like women almost never lie, and they'll say like only 2 to
Mhm.
10% of the time.
Mhm.
And by the way, even in its own terms, the statistic is a misreport because the study that it's from had between 2 and 10.9%. So they
Okay.
should be saying on their own terms 2 to 11%,
Uh-huh.
but they just say 10 anyway. Okay, but okay, whatever, who cares? But the thing is, like, you should wonder, well, how would we know how many reports of rape are false? Like, does that mean that only 2 to 10% of the time is the report disputed? Or does that mean that the researchers think that they have a crystal ball so that they know what happened in each of the cases where it was disputed so they can know whether the report was true
Mhm.
or false? It turns out no. What they actually mean is 2 to 10% of the time, it is clearly proven that the report was a lie.
Mhm.
Okay, but actually, the majority of the time, it's never discovered whether it was true or not. So we actually don't really know how many reports are false.
Mhm.
There's one study that found 40%. So there's
Mhm.
like a study in a particular town where um, there's only something like a little over 100 rape reports, but 40% of them were
Mhm.
found to be false, and they labeled them false only after the person making the report admitted that they had lied. Right.
I mean, how much of this could just be regular people don't understand the distinction between rape and sexual assault, and then round to the more heinous story? Or is that not really an issue?
I don't think that's really the issue. So the study that I referred to with the 40% false reports rate, this is from Eugene
Mhm.
Kanan, and he described some of the cases.
Mhm.
In the cases, they were not misunderstandings about what rape
Mhm.
means. They were the cases that he describes, which he, that gives us sort of like typical examples of what happened, are cases where the person was just straight out clearly lying.
Mhm.
Okay, so there would be a case where, so this is a fairly typical case. There's a woman who was cheating on her husband while her husband was away overseas.
Ah.
And then she became afraid that she had become pregnant from her lover. And so then she made up a story that she'd been raped. Okay, and they know that because she admitted that that's what happened.
Mhm.
Right, so, and that is like that's a
Mhm.
common explanation for a false rape report.
All right. Hmm. So I think it's next chapter. So, what is a woman exactly?
Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's an adult human female.
Yes.
I mean,
So yeah. So I mean, I wrote an essay about this where I said, okay, first of all, yes, literally, a woman is an adult human female, and I said, but we are experienced with the idea of sometimes we'll broaden a category just to be nice while remembering that the literal meaning is not what we're saying. So, for example, I think it's like if you someone is adopted and the adopting person has never actually biologically had a child, in practice, we just call them a parent. Now, if you say, but are they really the parent or really a parent at all? Then I think the correct answer is no. There's a bunch of people who got mad at me and said, no, that person is literally a parent. I said, well, like, suppose that your parents die and your grandparents raise you. Does that mean your grandparents become your parents?
well,
And I don't think so. But so, the
um,
idea of basically having allowing honorary members into a group just to be nice. What do you think about
yeah.
that?
Well, so this sounds to me like a semantic question.
Mm-hmm.
Like, would they really be your parents? So we have the phrase adoptive parents. So there's
Yes.
if you're adopted, then you have adoptive parents and you have biological parents.
Mm-hmm.
So that makes a
Yeah.
distinction.
Though
Then
we
you
also
might,
had the phrase, who are your real parents?
that's right. Yeah, we sometimes say that.
Right.
Right. But then, there are times when people will say, well, you're my real parent because you're the one who raised me, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
But okay, so then if you ask this like metaphysical question, okay, well, what's the real nature of parenthood? Man, that's not That's not a substantive question. It's semantic, okay? It's just a question about what does the word parent mean? It means whatever our conventions say. So you're just asking like what are the conventions? It doesn't matter what the conventions like we can change the conventions if we want to. So
Well, still, there's an idea of there's a literal meaning that is understood, and then there are honorary members that we
yeah.
count, even though they don't really fit the definition, to be nice. And it's sort of
Yeah,
a
yeah.
don't ask,
So
don't tell situation. We don't go and say that someone with an honorary degree from our college is a real graduate, and
yeah.
they don't go and try to claim that they are exactly the same as a real graduate. We
Yeah,
just
yeah.
avoid the issue in order to be nice.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so clearly they're not the same, right? So, and the
Yes.
adoptive parents are not the same as biological parents, but are they parents or not? Okay, that's a semantic
Mhm.
question. And
Hmm.
okay, now you might think, oh, but yeah, it's a semantic question, but it's clearly settled by our usage that no, they're not. But I don't find that clear, but it could just be that I'm not
Hmm.
in touch with the usage. Okay, but so about the word woman, like, okay, so
I
there's
mean,
a
you could.
semantic
Do you want
question.
to just say that's a semantic question too?
Um, yes. Now, so some semantic questions have a clear answer.
Yeah.
Okay, so like, am I a woman? Like, like, does the word woman apply to me? Like, you can make that a semantic question, but
Hmm.
it has a clear answer. Like, current
Hmm.
usage clearly makes me not a woman. Okay, now we could use the word woman so that it's tied to a person's gender, or we could have it be tied to a person's sex. And it's not completely clear to me what our current usage says. And
Hmm.
the reason is that, like, the current usage is, it just isn't designed for these cases because for almost all of human history, these were edge cases that most people never encountered a single time. Like most people in history probably never met a single transgender person. And so like there's not really a way of saying whether their usage included trans women as
Hmm.
women. Like they just right? They just there was never an occasion for them to make that distinction.
Of course, you might say that if it never came up, it's because the cat like the category was so clear that like if someone said there was something else, they would say that's impossible, something like that.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
So I guess in the Matt Walsh documentary, he went to and talked to some hunter gatherers about modern gender ideology, and they were just laughing and at how ridiculous it was.
Yeah, yeah.
So suggesting it wasn't merely they hadn't encountered, but they just thought that like the semantics are so cut and dry that it is like the definition of something where
Yeah,
it
yeah.
is clear.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. But I think it might have been that they didn't know the facts. So it
yes.
might have been that they didn't know factually that there are some
He
people
did
who's
try explaining it. I mean, like the harder one would be
yeah.
actual biological hermaphrodites, where that's one where I don't think anyone has really
Yeah,
come up
yeah,
with.
the intersex people. They're
Yes,
just a third thing, right?
yes,
But
yes.
okay, but so look, like this is my theory, all right? There's something in your brain which is your gender. Sex is in the body and particularly the reproductive system, and gender is in the brain.
Mhm.
So evolution has designed
Brain or mind?
okay, it's in the mind, but the mental
Mhm,
differences are caused by differences in the brain,
mhm.
which
I mean,
are,
like in principle, it could be hormones, which are like all over the body, right?
well, they have to affect your brain in some way in order to affect the mental state. So, um, okay, but anyway, but it's my theory, and it's a plausible theory that some of the psychological differences between males and females are adaptations created by
Mhm,
evolution. So there's like a cluster of these characteristics, like psychological characteristics that evolution designed to go with having a female body. And then there's another cluster that was designed to go with having a male body. But it's possible that something got mixed up and there's a person who has a female body but has the male cluster.
mhm.
And like, with the biological causes of it, like there's a difference in the brain. And there is evidence that there are differences in the brains of transgender people that are in the direction of the
Mhm.
usual male-female differences. Like they're in the direction of the gender that the people say they identify with. Okay, so if you told the like, the Maasai people or whatever it was, the tribe that Matt Walsh interviewed in Africa, if they knew that, it's not clear to me what their reaction would be, right?
Yeah, I think they would probably
Yeah.
just like,
I mean, they would probably reject it if you tried to tell
yes,
them that that's true,
right.
okay?
Mhm.
Right, so,
I mean, even there, so let's see, I mean, as you probably know, so I'm a dualist. You've at least got some dualist sympathy. So
Yeah.
you would say, look, even if it was just a purely mental thing, that they would figure that would go and cause some brain differences, and then the fact there's differences in the brain doesn't really settle anything.
Oh, wait. So, I mean, so, is it that there's a male soul and a
Yeah,
female soul, or a masculine and a
mhm,
feminine soul?
yeah,
I don't really think that. So I think that you could come back in another life
mhm,
as a member of the other sex and have
mhm,
the other gender. Okay. And I don't know if you know about this, but I have a paper about how reincarnation is real.
mhm. I
Um,
thought logically possible, not real.
no, I have an
All
argument
right,
that,
all
yeah, we
right.
have,
I think I misheard it as just logically possible, and I said, yeah, well, of course it's logically possible, but
yeah,
what? All right, but
yeah,
don't have time for that one.
yeah,
All right,
yeah.
all right. Now, your section on racial myths does not have any chapter on racial pay gaps.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
you can go and call me greedy for demanding that you do even more work for a low price, but why not? Why didn't you do that one?
I think it was well. So there's a limited number of chapters I want
Yes.
to put in. I wanted it to be
Sure. But even
really
it seems like
short.
that's maybe the biggest one of all, actually.
I mean, I keep hearing about the gender pay gap. I just hadn't heard people talking about the racial pay gap.
Hmm. I
But
mean, it's
maybe
sort of like anytime someone complains about it being a systemically racist society and blacks are
mm,
denied opportunities and everything that is supposed to stem from lack of economic opportunity, from crime to family
yeah.
breakdown and everything else. So I think of this as
Well,
all a story about racial pay gaps.
I think I had heard people complaining that blacks are poorer than whites, but I hadn't heard them quoting the pay gap statistic like the way they do with
Mhm.
men versus
Yeah,
women.
it's true that America one is less often quoted, but in terms of it's because of racism that blacks do poorly in our society, that's
Yeah, yeah.
a very standard one.
Yeah. But yeah, so I did look that up and it's a similar story.
Mhm,
So black people get paid less than white people on average, but that doesn't control for occupation and education,
mhm,
whatever. And so,
mhm,
and after you add in controls, the gap virtually
mhm,
disappears, right? So
mhm.
you get like, it goes down from like 13 cents to like 2 cents or something.
Hmm. So I've worked with this data a lot, actually.
Oh,
So the raw gap's a lot bigger than that, I think. So I think the raw
oh,
gap is more like 30 cents. And then
okay.
it's actually pretty hard to make the gap go away unless you bring in IQ controls. So you
Oh,
need those IQ controls to really shrink the gap. If you don't have that one, if you just go and control for the more standard stuff of years of education, years of experience, then and a few other things along those lines, then you can get maybe half the gap. But it really is that IQ gap that is explaining so much of what remains. And
yeah, yeah,
of course, that's one where people are very nervous about it. I mean, often
yeah.
economists will just go and change the language and say, well, it's a gap in cognitive skill. And
Yes.
then rather than IQ tests, they've got some test of academic performance, which, however, correlates really highly if you were to give an IQ test.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Well,
the other thing is, so it is very rare to actually have really good data on occupation, actually.
oh,
So
okay.
you
Yeah.
might remember, I'm also a big fan of that Warren Farrell book, Why Men Earn More.
Yeah.
And but he himself, he doesn't have any data set where he's got his 25 variables. He basically has 25 variables, each of which he's got some plausible account of why this would matter and pointing out that it's big. But again, like the gold standard really would be I want a data set with 1 million people and scores for all 25 job characteristics and then run it.
Yeah, yeah.
Hasn't
Of
been
course.
done,
Yeah.
although I think a lot of the reason it hasn't been done is people are worried what they would find.
That's right. Yeah. And then you get in trouble if you
Yeah.
if you found the wrong thing and you
Yes.
publish it.
And also obviously that is some very expensive research to do.
Yes.
And
All right.
people are not likely to fund research that's going to come out with the wrong answer. So that's another big issue.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. So I just looked at this survey from payscale.com.
Mm-hmm.
So whatever, they had a survey in which they said that black-white pay gap was 13 cents, and then it went down to 2 cents after they controlled for a bunch of factors.
So yeah, I mean,
But you might
so
have
I mean, I
better.
believe that is that data set. I mean, I've seen
Yeah.
much more normal data, nationally represented data sets. So I think it is a lot bigger.
Yeah, yeah.
But all right, now here is one of the weird negative reactions that I saw to your book. People read the table of contents and then got mad about the chapters on climate change without reading them, and then called you a climate denier. All right, so what is
Yeah,
a
yeah.
fair summary of your actual position on this issue?
Yeah, yeah. You're like, if you go beyond just like the table of contents, yeah, at least read the part where it says myth so that you can know what the myth is supposed to be.
Yeah.
You know, the myth about climate change is that it's an existential threat, right?
Mhm.
Meaning that it's likely to destroy either our civilization or our species or life on Earth or something like that.
Mhm.
Okay, that's a myth. Also, by the way, it's a myth that 97% of climate scientists agree on the cause of global warming. Um, it's not 97%, although it's not a myth that there's a consensus.
Mhm.
Like most climate scientists agree that human beings are at least part of the cause of global warming, and and I think a significant part of the cause. Um, but then 97% is kind of arrived at in a bogus way.
Mhm. Right. But the existential part, that's really the myth that actually matters. If
Yes.
it's some civilization ending thing or even species ending thing,
Yeah, yeah,
you can see why
yeah,
people are really agitated about it. On the other hand, if it's like number 20 on the list of global problems.
yeah. Yeah, so there's in surveys there's like large numbers of people who think that global warming is likely
Mhm.
to kill everyone.
Right.
And then these people should be outraged. Like Greta Thunberg is outraged because I'd be outraged too because like people are not fucking doing anything about this thing that's going to kill all of us in like 12 years or whatever.
Yeah, of
About
course,
that.
as an economist, I'm saying, then why aren't you like maxing out every credit card, every possible source of debt, so that you can
Yeah, yeah,
live it up in your final years, something like that,
yeah, yeah,
or I mean, even go and pay to get the whatever you bunker you need to survive it, and like no one's going to be around to collect the debts in the apocalypse. So,
yeah, yeah.
but
But yeah, yeah, yeah.
perhaps
But
a bit flippant.
but then the next thing you should think is, huh, wonder why nobody's doing anything about it.
Yeah.
And it turns out the reason is that, well, the people who know about it actually don't think that it's an existential threat. Like almost no serious expert thinks that.
Mhm.
Like,
Right.
and just
Yes.
like mainstream estimates are like, oh, maybe the IPCC projects that ocean levels will rise by a couple of feet by
Mhm.
2100. But then you hear these activists saying, "Oh my God, New York is going to be submerged."
Yes.
Like, no, actually, there's not a lot of places where people live under 2 feet elevation. Like,
Mhm. Mhm.
there's not a lot of people who need to worry about this flooding.
Right. So, this reminds me of my favorite book on this topic. Have you read Alex Epstein's Fossil Future?
No, I didn't.
Yes. So it's quite good. In particular, on this point, he says something that seems totally true, although it never would have occurred to me, which is that there's a lot of variation in sea level rise all over the world. I basically pictured it like one level and it all must move and sink, but apparently that's just wrong. And what he shows is, look, there's a bunch of areas that have had quite several feet of change of sea level, and it was not devastating for them because they adapt. And on the other
Hmm.
hand, and so then it's like, so this is not something where we're speculating about maybe we could adapt. It's something where we know that people are adapting to these kinds of moderate changes all the time. And if it were more pronounced, it's not like a totally new technology or a new problem. It's a problem that we're actually quite equipped to
Yeah,
deal
yeah,
with.
yeah.
So,
No, that's
so I
right.
do
So,
recommend the book, and I think you would enjoy it quite a bit. So just a
yeah.
little aside, you've helped me come up with this special category of books in my mind, which I call, these are the books that settle questions. These are the books where if your goal is just to spend your life thinking about a question, these books are bad news because they just give the answer. And afterwards, there's just not that much more to do because the question was just done. It was answered so effectively. So, for example, I think of Your Problem, Political Authority. It's just a book where it's read like, this really just settles this question here. And
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
now, the answer is now known, and we can spend time on the details, but there's not really going to be that much more work to do on this question from now on. Or, for example, I think of my book, The Case Against Education. I really think I settled the question of the economics of education in that book, right? Call
Yeah.
me crazy. And I
Yeah.
think of Fossil Future, it's the book that settled the question of climate change and energy. My friend Tyler Cowen, I notice he just doesn't like any of these books. And I have this pet story that he just doesn't like the idea that you can just deprive him of a topic of conversation. Doesn't like the
Yeah.
idea that, look, it's just answered now, and we can quibble about some details, but there's some books that are at a level of quality where they just get to the bottom of it, and now it's known. So,
Yeah.
any reaction to this idea, or like, do
Yeah.
you think that you have achieved in any of your books what I am saying you achieved in at least one of your books?
Well, I feel like the arguments I gave settle the question for me. And now,
Mhm.
um,
Settle it for reasonable people.
and
And
and I
is the idea of like any open-minded, intelligent person who reads the book at least ought to be convinced. Or you can flip it
yeah.
around and saying if you read it and you're not convinced, then you weren't open-minded and or intelligent.
Well, um, I that's the way it seemed to me when I wrote it, but I know that there are smart people who will still dispute it
Mm-hmm.
afterward, and I don't think they're all dishonest. So
Yeah, well, there's just
just
open-mindedness is the
yeah,
last
yeah,
one. Yeah.
yeah. I'm confused. Like I'm
Mm-hmm.
confused about how
Mm-hmm.
there's so much disagreement in philosophy, and I don't know what's going on. But yeah, it is plausible that they're just not open-minded.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
It's like a lot of my story about what your big contribution to philosophy is. It's precisely this idea that if you start up with some premises, you reason validly, end up in a conclusion that's crazy, it shows the premises are wrong. And that the right way to go about philosophy is to find some premises that independently make sense to people that don't share a giant worldview, where you can get people like from a wide range of perspectives to say, yes, those premises do make sense to me initially. Right. Because I think about this, it's a method for solving problems. It's not just that it solves some existing stock of problems, it's a way of
yeah,
dealing with new problems also.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And, so like I think open-mindedness is the most important thing if you're gonna like, yeah, what are the big mistakes that people make? Yeah, the big mistakes that people make are uh, jumping to conclusions and dogmatism. Right? That is, forming beliefs too quickly and then being too slow to change them. Those are
Okay, so
the-
I thought that was just a joke. Those are the two mistakes: is being too open-minded or not open-minded enough. But yes, jumping to
uh,
conclusions isn't really open-minded.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Shortage of open-mindedness is the first problem, and then dogmatism is the other one. And those are not the same because one of them is like adopting too quickly, and then yeah.
Mhm.
Okay. Um. Yeah, anyway, that's
All right.
my main advice is develop intellectual virtues.
Yes. All right. So you end the book with talking about the rise of wokeism. It's a pretty weird story, isn't it? I mean, just even if you compare it to other intellectual movements, other religions or secular religions, what is your quick story about what happened and what in the world's going on? Like how, I mean, just think about like historical parallels where in the course of 15 years, a number of views that have been held widely for thousands of years by almost everyone became things that people get mad at you over.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, well, it's weird because like I don't think wokeism is all that common. Like I don't think there's that many people who actually just sincerely
Mm-hmm.
embrace the woke views. It's just
Mm-hmm.
that they infiltrate all these cultural institutions and then
Mm-hmm.
like they just have this cultural power. So
Mm-hmm.
they get to make people feel like outcasts and actually they get to outcast people even though they're the minority. They get to
Mm-hmm.
outcast the majority for expressing the majority view. But yeah, what the short story about what happened is I think it originated in the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement occurred because there were actual serious injustices and serious racism and sexism and other kinds of prejudice in America. Okay, but basically then in the movement, um, people got this sense of meaning in their lives by being part of this movement for justice, which was genuinely a movement for justice, was genuinely promoting justice. Okay, and they got this sense of community, like they were a group of people working towards a common goal, which is, these are two things that people really need psychologically, and then they just didn't want to give that up. Okay, but the civil rights movement basically won. And so, but you don't want to give up. You
Mm-hmm.
don't want to give this up, like this thing that's giving you meaning and community in your life. Okay. And so, what you have to do is sort of move the goalposts. You have to like come up with
Mm-hmm.
theories. And because it was big in academia,
Mm-hmm.
we have a lot of smart people with a lot of smart, highly educated people to work on how we can keep the movement alive. And I'm sure they weren't explicitly thinking this to themselves, but like they have a psychological motive to keep coming up with ways that the problem is still occurring. Even though it might seem like we've won, we really haven't because there's still some racism out there. And then you have to like have increasingly expansive accounts of racism.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that does make sense, although it's also one where think you have to reassess the justice of the original movement. So if you think of the original movement as saying all gaps in performance by race and gender are caused by unfairness, and then you get rid of the unfairness and then the gaps don't go away, it's like, well, kind of looks like you guys were overstating.
Yeah, yeah,
And like you didn't really know. So, like, why exactly are you such heroes?
yeah, yeah,
If you were dishonest and just and tried and claimed that you figured out what the sole cause of the problem was, and you were mistaken. And I think a
yeah,
lot
yeah,
of the reason why wokeness spread is precisely because the dogma of all the differences in performance must be due to unfairness. Every time you remove some unfairness and you don't see the gap go away, it's like there's got to be some hidden unfairness, some other unfairness. And eventually you may just come up with this unfalsifiable doctrine of unfairness is that which prevents the outcomes from being equalized.
yeah, yeah. Like I think this is basically what happened to the woke people. Like they're basically their reason for believing in systemic racism is, um, yeah, there are gaps in achievement between blacks and whites and other groups, and they don't like this, and they don't want to say that it might be that some groups are more productive. They don't want to say that because that's whatever, that's racist. And so then, yeah, they just so then they just come up with these increasingly subtle things like, oh, and then like, it's getting harder and harder to find actual racists. It's
Yes.
like, well, it's unconscious. That's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then well, maybe it's systemic, meaning that there's racism that's in the system that's not in any particular person. Like, and so that's how we can keep up the story that racism is still holding back the minorities, even though it's getting so hard to find actual racists.
Yes. Yes. All right. So, what controversial woke claims are actually true? I'll just lead the witness by saying maybe you want to say veganism.
Yeah. Yes. And so I'm not sure if it counts as woke, but if that counts, then that would be one of the few things. Well, actually, I mean, like, no, the woke people got a lot of things right. Like, you know, yeah, you shouldn't oppress people. That's right. And right. And I think you also shouldn't.
That's a little bit unfair to give it to them because it would be a view held by people, almost everybody, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So it's got to be something that they are
Well,
especially likely to hold and not just the sky is blue, right?
right. Well, say they're right to be um so like, they're especially against racism. Okay, well,
Mm-hmm.
they're right that there's a huge history of racism and it was really bad and it's really
Mm-hmm.
important to stop it. And I think also like, oh, there's a history of like oppressing the other species and we should stop doing that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually still going on.
Mm-hmm.
So like you would think that they should be more upset about that, but it doesn't seem like they are. It
Mm-hmm.
seems like they're more interested in like complaining about the stuff that's supposedly happening to the other humans, right? That
Or
it,
just a word. Or
yeah, sorry.
more upset about the wrong word being said.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like, compare somebody using the wrong pronoun for you, to like being
Being
raised in
tortured to death in a
torture-like
factory farm.
conditions. Yeah, yeah, and then killed so that you can have your body chopped up and eaten. Like, I would rather have somebody use the wrong pronoun for me like a million times than live on a
Uh,
factory farm.
in fact, I think you would get used to it after about the 30th time. And then
Yeah.
additional marginal harm would be very low.
Yeah.
Right. So on my Substack, I went and just solicited readers to give me more missing myths. So the missing myths, the myths that we are greedily saying, "Hey, Mike, why didn't you go and do more work for no additional money, and
Yeah.
thereby enlighten the world?"
Yeah.
So I already mentioned this first one, but I'll just repeat it for the sake of completeness. So discrimination is the main cause of racial pay gaps. And yeah, this is one where I have actually worked with the data quite a bit myself. So I'm very comfortable saying like the gender pay gap, there's actually overwhelming evidence for the common sense view that racial pay gaps stem largely from differences in worker productivity rather than unfairness. All right, so we got that one.
Yeah.
Now, here's one where I think we have talked about it, but I'm not sure. All right, so here is what I think is another myth that you could have talked about in your book, which is there's no such thing as intelligence. And even if there is, IQ tests are a bad way to measure intelligence. So, what do you think about that myth? If it is a myth?
Yeah. No,
Myth?
that would also be a good one to have in there.
Yes. Right. Because it's very factual, right? A lot of your thinking, when a lot of people went and did exactly the opposite of what I told them and say, like, a narrow factual question where we can get to a highly confident answer about what's really going on. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and
so you think there's
it's
something, there is such a thing as intelligence, actually.
There, yeah, I've noticed. I've noticed intelligence. Like
Like when
some
you're
people,
grading exams, maybe.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, for
Not
me,
just
like my IQ realism is basically at its peak on exam day when I say, like, there's some kids who never came to class who know all the material.
yeah,
There's some kids who worked hard and were there every day who don't understand anything.
yeah, yeah. No, that's right. Like, just like interacting with people, you can notice differences in intelligence, but yeah, especially if you test people. And I'm under the impression that so there's dispute about what is the cause of
Yes.
IQ gaps between different groups,
Mm-hmm.
but there really isn't dispute about the existence of the
Mm-hmm.
gaps. And
Yes.
actually, there's
Mm-hmm.
some pretty big gaps. So
Yeah,
like,
of course.
so black versus white is like one standard deviation or
Yep.
something
Mm-hmm.
like that, and
Yep.
that's pretty big.
Yes.
And okay, but and it seems to me like just the agreed upon fact is incendiary enough. Like I,
For
I
sure.
think I think progressives would be super
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable just like talking about that, just acknowledging that
Mm-hmm.
fact.
Mm-hmm.
And like
I mean,
there
I
you go.
know some very left wing researchers who will privately talk about it very frankly,
Yeah.
but they're nervous about publishing it. If they do publish it, it's just full of professions of loyalty and innocence before they actually get to the meat of the question. And I think there's a lot of others who just they know the facts, but they don't want to ever publish anything on it. And then finally, there's this intermediate category, those say, well, yeah, like since I'm never going to publish anything on it, I don't need to learn anything about it. And so I can actually, in good conscience, believe the normal thing. It's like, well, that's a pretty low bar for good conscience.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like I haven't done significant research. I have
Mhm.
just accidentally acquired knowledge. Like, I accidentally acquired the knowledge that the black white IQ gap is like one standard deviation or something.
Mhm.
Um, and apparently the gap between if like you tested people in Africa,
Mhm.
there's an even bigger
Yeah,
gap.
right.
Um,
Scott Alexander did a very recent piece where he was pointing out, look, it would be very bad for the environmental story if African Africans to the same IQ as African Americans because their environment is clearly way worse.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so I actually managed to take some other papers on international adoption and then combine them with these estimates of average national IQ to get what I'll say is like a lower bound on how much environmental depression there is of IQ in the third world. And I think the evidence is quite strong that there is a lot of environmental depression of their IQ. I mean, I actually like in my book Open Borders, I talked about this, and my editor was saying you should take this out. It's incendiary, and I'm like, look, well, it's relevant, right? And it actually, if you understand what the argument, it is a further argument for immigration. So I don't know why I would take it out. And if someone's going to get offended by this, then they're just totally unreasonable. So it stayed in, and I was very pleased with that.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, here's another one. Let me see what you think about this. Just race is a social construct.
Yeah.
Myth?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't know what the hell people mean by is it
Yes, I'll
being a
agree. Oh,
social
that's the
construct.
that's the main reason why I was a little hesitant to just put it as a myth.
Yeah,
But it's one where it's like, well, are you saying that there's some social element to racial classifications? It's like,
yeah,
yeah, well, duh, right? So,
yeah. So
but on the other hand, like are you saying that there is not a very high correlation between socially identified race and the DNA identified race? Then
yeah,
crazy.
yeah. So like, yeah, there are clearly objective, not conventionally created differences between blacks and whites.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could have people who were not raised in our culture. Like
Yeah.
you get space aliens, and like they could learn to identify the
Mm-hmm.
uh, people with African ancestry, recent African ancestry,
Mm-hmm.
and separate them from the people of Asian or European. Okay. Um, but there are some aspects of our racial categories that are weird. Okay,
Sure.
so like to me, the weirdest thing is the category of Hispanic or
Yeah,
Latino.
I
Like,
was hoping you would say that.
like, oh, so like it includes Spaniards and the people the Spaniards conquered. Like, like the
Uh-huh.
Aztecs and the Spaniards, how are they the same race?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Yeah,
that's one where the obvious story is, well, look, there's an incredible amount, a range of admixture from 100% European to 100% indigenous out of Latin Americans. But in the United States, they've got this shared language and they've got a political alliance going. And you don't want to go and upset them by pointing out that they actually are quite different from each other and
yeah,
basically splitting their alliance. They already, they want to go and get the alliance bigger. And also, as you might notice, the Europeans tend to dominate these organizations. So,
Yeah, and
so it's another one. It's like, well, you are undermining solidarity by pointing out the facts. So that is a definitely fun one. And again, especially it's one where you can see the evolution of the category. Because basically, until U.S. civil right or U.S. civil rights law exists, there are Mexican Americans, there's Cuban Americans, but there's just no such thing as an Hispanic. So it's invented. Or or the more ridiculous one is the Asian American Pacific Islander category, which never existed until it was put on the census as a bizarre compromise between the American Indian lobbies and Hawaiian lobbies. And then they put it on just to go and basically, like, the Pacific Islanders, they don't want to be treated as East Asians for college admission purposes, because then they will get really screwed over. And then they've got, but I say, like,
So
that's one where you can say, well, maybe the social construct part is the part where you are deliberately ignoring genetic evidence. And if you really want to understand race, you just need to go harder into the DNA.
no, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so those are good examples of, it being a social construct, or our actual the category that we're actually using
Yes.
being socially constructed, meaning
Yes.
something like it's not based on the
Mm-hmm.
scientifically interesting characteristics in the thing that we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about. It was based on
Yeah.
political pressures.
Or you
But
say
like,
it's about the social scientific characteristics rather than the biological characteristics. But yeah, I mean,
yeah,
like, again, but your thing is, so normally when somebody says this, there is an agenda, and the agenda is you can't say that genetics matter
yeah,
because
yeah,
it's all socially constructed. But on the other hand, you might say, well, the social construction is the reason why we need to go harder in on the genetics and say, well, look, what exactly are the cases where we've got a very clear genetic connection? What are the ones where it's random? What are the ones where we know what happened? Like, Spaniards went and invaded Latin America, and then there's a giant range of everything from 100% European to 100% indigenous. And then in the United States, they've got a weird alliance going, and it's undermined
yeah,
solidarity to point out facts.
yeah. Well, so there's like biological versus non-biological
Mm-hmm.
bases, but I don't necessarily think that there's something wrong with using non-biological bases.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but my problem is, like, sometimes the basis for the categorization is not explanatory.
Mm-hmm.
So, like this thing that you're saying about the political factions, like, so it's not just that they're not looking at the biology, it's that they're not looking at anything that's relevant to explaining people's behavior. They're just like trying to promote
Well, like, some
their
recent
interests.
ancestors all spoke Spanish. That's what's relevant. And yeah, so that's about what they've got. Let's
Yeah.
see. So here are some suggested myths that other readers came out, and I deliberately called the ones that didn't listen to you. All right.
Yeah.
So here's one. All right. Public education results would improve if only we spent more money on education.
Yeah. Yeah. That also would have been a good thing to include, but would have required more
Yes.
time and work on my
Right.
part. Um,
Right.
and
I mean,
yeah,
that's one
basically,
I know a lot about, and I'll say, like, there's definitely some results that we can improve by teaching in a different way.
yeah.
If we, right? I mean, I think that's a lot better established than needing more money. Like, most obviously, if you really want to teach a foreign language, then you got to do the immersion method from day one. No
Yeah.
more stupid singing of songs, and like doing a flag from the country where they speak the language. To start speaking the language and telling people, as I was told, they say, actually, do you have to do a foreign language for philosophy?
No. Um, I mean, I did take French in high school,
Okay.
but it
Yeah.
didn't have to
So
do
I
with
actually was under the misimpression I needed a foreign language for my PhD. And then by the time I was in the German class, I knew that wasn't true, but I was enjoying it. But the first day was "Man kann hier kein Englisch sprechen," and like, it was but I understand nine. And so like within a
Okay.
semester, I was
And
better
you
in
enjoyed
German than
this?
after 3 years of Spanish in high school,
Oh, I
because
see.
they were using the correct method, and it didn't
Mm,
cost anything more except probably more tears,
I
because
see.
it hurts people's feelings to go and have these high standards and to really enforce them.
Yeah,
All
yeah.
right. So here, this one actually, maybe you forget, but I remember 35 years ago, you were having an argument with a grad student at UC Berkeley on this exact point. America has been steadily gutting funding for social services since the 80s.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Yeah, funding keeps going up. Um,
Yes.
yeah, but so Reagan slowed the increase
Yes.
in social
So, and
welfare.
that's true. And they even adjusting for inflation and per capita, he slowed the increase rather than actually reducing.
Yeah. So yeah. Like I mean, and this is apropos of okay, why do we continue to have poverty? Is it because the government is not giving enough money? Doesn't look like it, because it looks like when we keep increasing, this is what Charles Murray says, we keep
Yes.
increasing the funding, and then like the poverty either continues or like even
Mhm.
increases.
Right. Now, like, so, very standard among the most data savvy economists to say those measures are really crummy. And if you do the correct thing, which is after tax and transfer poverty, then poverty actually has greatly reduced. This is the
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing
So
where logically you would think that very left wing people would want to agree with this, except it deprives them of the ability to say that everything is terrible right now. And that's why we need more money.
yeah, yeah,
And they
yeah.
would rather deny that the welfare state or even really exists and then insist that we need a lot more money than to say it exists and it's done, it had a lot of progress. So,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is kind of it's odd in a way, although yeah, you understand enough about political rationality to realize that it's not really so odd after all.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
remember once I was on Al Jazeera right around the time of the last big European economic financial crisis, and there was this Italian woman. They're saying, the dismantling of the welfare state. And I said, look, the welfare state has not been dismantled. You know that very well. The Italian welfare state is enormous. And just the progressive dismantling of the welfare state. And like, adding the word progressive does not change the fact that the welfare state is still enormous. And like there were a bunch of people like in like, social media saying like, get that smug look off your face, Kaplan. And like support, there's a limit to my ability to suppress my emotions.
Yeah.
This
That's the
woman
only
was
face
just
you
making
got.
stuff up.
Can't
All right.
can't help it.
Here's one where I didn't know much about this until I met Robin Hanson, but increased government spending on healthcare leads to significantly better health outcomes. Do you know much
Yeah.
about this one?
No.
Yes, this is
Wow.
one where there have been a number of famous medical experiments where some people randomly were given government health insurance and others weren't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I
then the
heard that.
outcomes were, indifference in health outcomes were very mild. The most recent one was the Oregon Medicaid experiment, where some people in Oregon randomly got it, some didn't.
Yeah,
And the
yeah, I heard
main
that.
difference was just in subjective health. And the interesting fact about it was the subjective health of people improved before the program kicked in.
Oh, oh, nice.
So it's like, yeah, talk about a placebo. This is a placebo so strong that before they even give you the placebo, you feel better.
Yeah, I heard, I don't know if it was that or another one. I heard that there was a study where like, some people got better health insurance and it
Yes.
resulted in their spending more money. That is like
Yeah, yeah. So
consuming
that
more
that was
expensive.
the Rand one from the 70s. This one,
Okay.
basically, that one, it's old enough that a lot of people say, well, you don't have any idea how much healthcare has improved. But then the Oregon one is
Mm.
only like 15 years old. So,
Okay.
but yeah, it had no actual effect on Obamacare that this was shown.
Yeah.
Um, all right. Here's another one. The Native Americans were peaceful and living in harmony with nature.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're not an expert on Native American prehistory,
No, I'm
but
not. Yeah.
yes.
But
Um,
yeah, but like everybody should know that, well, actually there's a lot of killing in primitive societies, like a
yeah.
lot more than our
Yes.
society.
Yes. I mean, the only defense I've heard of the normal view is these are primitive societies that have been corrupted by contact with modern societies, or they've been shoved off into the least desirable parts of their countries, and that's why they're violent now. But trust me, before the settlers came, it was good. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, and I think we have like uh we have paleontological evidence so like,
yeah,
from like, grave sites from like
mhm,
long ago where like
yes,
there's evidence of people being killed by weapons, and so
yeah.
just they just were a lot more violent.
Yep. And here's the last one. Ancient matriarchal societies existed.
Yeah, yeah, it's good. Yeah, so I haven't looked into that either, but I would be surprised if there
Yeah.
were.
Yes. All right. So moving towards the end, there's, as you know, you've got a lot of competition. There's a lot of anti-woke writers.
Yeah.
I am not, this is not just damning with faint praise when I say that you've written the best book. But yeah, a lot of the other ones just aren't that good.
Yeah.
But like, I mean, obviously you could just go and let's see, you could just insult the competition, but let me put it this way: in the friendliest possible spirit, with the greatest generosity of heart, how can your competition improve?
Yeah.
How can the other
So
anti woke thinkers do a better job and be like you?
Yeah, so like yeah, I have to confess that I didn't do a lot of research in that area, meaning that like I didn't go and read the competition really. Um I felt
Oh
like, well,
well, so
I've
you
got
managed to outdo them without even seeing what they were doing. All right, so yeah, I have read
maybe,
quite a bit.
maybe it helped, to not see what they were doing because maybe I would have been influenced. But yeah, so I guess like I don't know, this is fairly general advice. Like, okay, try to um, try to focus on objective facts, meaning sort of like empirical facts that could be decisively established rather than like
Mm-hmm.
broad matters of opinion. At least that was my idea. So my idea was like, well, there's some people who like they're not on board with me yet, but they're willing to listen, hopefully. Because if
Mm-hmm.
somebody's not willing to listen, whatever, I can't do anything. Okay, but there are people who like they don't know for sure about this woke ideology, but they need something that's convincing. And like me giving this sort of matter of opinion or like talking about philosophical disagreements that
Mm-hmm.
I have, like will not necessarily convince even an open-minded, rational person, right? Like if I try to say that they're making some philosophical mistake, but if I say, look, here's a matter of fact, like here's the evidence, like if you looked at like the Michael Brown case, for example,
Mm-hmm.
man, the evidence is just so clear. It's
Mm-hmm.
like anyone is going to have to agree
Mm-hmm.
that the left-wing portrayals of that case were factually wrong. And then I wanted to just go through a
And by left
number
wing
of these.
portrayals, you really mean almost all mainstream media, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah, like and the mainstream media like it appeared that they didn't care about what actually happened about the actual facts of the case. But okay, so like one piece of advice just like focus on facts that could be established pretty decisively empirically. Um, and then my other thought was I need a lot of them. Like I shouldn't just focus on a couple of things. So I have like 20 different myths or something. Because what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to go through each of these. In each chapter, you're supposed to say, yep, those people were wrong. Like, you read the quotations of the things people were saying, you're supposed to say, yeah, no, that's objectively wrong. But then by the end, you're supposed to say, wow, it's this 20 times in a row, and I heard all of those myths, right? And like,
Mm-hmm.
and especially if you were inclined to believe them when you heard them, and then you see that they're all wrong, then you're supposed to make a generalization. Like, yeah, maybe I should not listen to these people anymore. Yeah, maybe I should not listen to the left-leaning media, which is like the mainstream media, and like maybe I can't even listen to academics when they're talking about politics.
Mm-hmm. Like one of the main things that I think of is just you are much less emotional than almost all the competition.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, so
Uh,
often I find when I'm reading the competition, even when I agree with them on a particular point, my thinking is still you are not controlling the emotional tendencies that would make you unreliable. And so, like, if I can independently check it, great. I mean, it is true. Is like you might say, look, isn't it hard to go and find out that mainstream media is just blatantly lying on a lot of big things and not get upset?
oh yeah. Um, I guess I have an even keeled temperament.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
You
but
don't feel that you've worked on that or achieved that you don't feel like that's an achievement that you have made an effort to overcome normal human
yeah.
nature, or you feel like you are just abnormal?
Well, I guess a little of both. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm just less emotional than most people. Maybe especially about intellectual and when political things, but also that yeah, no, sometimes I would start thinking about a political issue and I would notice myself being upset. And then I would attempt to be less upset and try to find it just
Mm-hmm.
okay, just relax, just find out what actually happened. Or they were like, the abortion issue, like I just have negative feelings about baby killing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's just like killing fetuses just kind of feels like baby killing. So I just have a negative emotion about it.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to suppress that in order
Mm-hmm.
to just think,
Mm-hmm.
intellectually, philosophically,
Mm-hmm.
well, okay, yeah, it looks like baby killing, but is it really like that?
All right. So maybe you can't answer this one, but I'll ask anyway. So, what's the second best anti woke book?
Yeah, so I just don't know. Like I I'm sure there's some good ones, and I haven't
Mm-hmm.
looked for them.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed John McWhorter's Woke Racism,
Mm-hmm.
right? But I don't I just that was like just like the only one that I read.
Mm-hmm.
So there's
All
probably
right.
some other good ones.
Hmm. All right. All right. Last question. I've been hearing a lot of people saying woke has peaked. Uh, could you first of all review the total ambiguity of the statement and then give us a nuanced forecast?
Yeah,
So,
has it peaked? I guess it peaked. I mean, I don't know. I can't predict the future, but I guess it looked back.
gee, that's the only thing that's really good to predict. But
Yeah, yeah,
well, okay, so well, in that case, let me lead the witness. Like so, like
yeah.
Tyler Cowen loves saying this, and finally, it said over what time horizon? It like it's gonna fall over the next billion years, and finally, okay, no, the next 3 to 5 years. So, well, gee, maybe if you said it that way, I wouldn't disagree, and yet it also wouldn't get you much attention because it's not a very exciting claim.
Oh, you mean if he'd given the 3 to 5 years?
Yes, if you'd given the 3 to 5, it spoke of the next 3 to 5 years. Yeah. So I mean, my honest view is like the maximum level of wokeness was right after George Floyd. That was the all-time peak. There was 1 month where if you turned on television, it would just be self-flagellation and Aunt Jemima syrup disappearing, and just one crazy symbolic gesture of like, I cannot believe what an evil society we've been up till now, but we're gonna make amends. And
Yeah.
that was the craziest month where it was almost all anybody was talking about. And then it's declined since then. But then it's like, well, like, what do you think? The people can maintain that level of fervor all the time? It just goes against human nature to stay that
Yeah.
upset that widely for that long of a period. And
Yes.
so, but then if you were saying, okay, well, what about over a 10-year period, over a 20-year period? I mean, I would
Hmm.
say the most reasonable story is that, first of all, we look at demographics. We see that young people are, by almost every measure, a lot woker than older people. We also have a very reliable rule of political psychology, which that hardly anybody changes their mind about the political views they get when they're young. Snap one and one together, and I think we've got a pretty woke future. Convinced?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, well,
So,
I'm not
because
sure. I'm not sure either, but like
yeah,
if you had to bet, and you got to bet, man.
yeah, I guess I would bet on it decreasing. But
Decreasing,
yeah, yeah,
decreasing
the amount,
relative to today, or
yeah,
I agree it's decreased relative to the George
the
Floyd
George
month.
Floyd, yeah. Yeah. So I guess I would expect it to decrease even more relative to today, but
Yeah. So
this just feels
going
like a
against
guess.
the demographics, what will change? Will
Yeah.
young people be one of the first generations in
Yeah.
history that just admitted their political philosophy of their
No.
youth is wrong?
Like,
What's going to
no,
happen?
people are going to read my book.
Yeah. Let us not confuse what ought to happen with what shall happen,
Yeah.
Michael. So
Um,
you like, what would be the mechanism where woke would go down over the next 25 years?
yeah. So I don't know, but it looks to me like in general, like clearly incorrect views tend to decline. There tends to be progress over time of people like getting rid of obvious errors and stuff like that.
Hmm.
And so,
So do you think that's better than the cyclical view that, especially on stuff human beings care about, that we just go from more to more reasonable views to less reasonable, more reasonable, less reasonable? I mean, that's
yeah.
more meaning like there's on questions that are not very emotional, like natural science, then the story of progress makes sense. On
Yeah.
questions that are very emotional, like political philosophy, that's one where, well, like honestly, like after the Soviet Union collapsed, we had like a decade where you could say, socialism is dead forever. And then like no new facts come along to put it in a better light, but it just comes back to life again. And then there's a new generation that loves the ideals and start taking over countries again and promoting it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, part of what's going on is that people don't know what socialism means.
Mhm.
Right? But anyway, but
Although part of what's going on there is they're being deliberately ambiguous to antagonize others.
yeah.
As I've been a number of debates where they just don't want to clarify it. And like, I just think the only real explanation is they know that some people will be thinking that they're talking about the Soviet Union and other people will be thinking Sweden, and they don't want to have to tell you which one they mean. Ha
Yeah.
ha.
Yeah.
Isn't it hilarious that I don't tell you whether I mean gulags or a Swedish daycare center?
Yeah. 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 And so, sometimes I have to tell my students that like actually Sweden isn't socialist. Like, and I think they might be farther from socialist than us. I'm not sure. But okay, but anyway, getting back to the thing. yeah, is wokeness going to go down? Yeah, so I don't know, but like I have the feeling that there's like a backlash
Yes.
against the wokeness.
Right. I mean, this is another disagreement I have with Tyler when he uses the word backlash. When I say, okay, do you mean just resistance? And once people start saying a crazy thing, some people finally show up and say no, not the crazy thing. If that's
Yeah,
backlash, then of course there's backlash. On the other hand, if
yeah,
backlash means that the woke people push their luck so much that they actually wind up getting less than they would have gotten if they had asked for less, that I think is a better definition of backlash. It's the idea of you pushed your luck and now you're walking away from the table with less than if you had just moderated your demands. And that's
yeah,
one where I still am not convinced overall that they have misplayed their hand. I mean, I'd say
yeah,
like a pretty good strategy in politics is just to ask for everything you want and
yeah,
freak
yeah.
out at people if they don't give you everything. And then usually you'll get, some percentage of that. And if you had been more compromising, maybe you just would have
Probably
gotten
get
an even
less.
a percentage, a same percentage of the more moderate thing you asked for.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess I think that's right in general. And I guess I think there is a point at which you did too much
Mm-hmm.
and somebody will just completely dismiss you. Um, well, so my sense is like, okay, yeah, there were a bunch of people who were not on board with the wokeness, but they were afraid to speak out,
Mm-hmm.
and then the fear is decreasing,
Mm-hmm.
and so the speaking out is
Yeah.
increasing. And then
Right.
there's like, like the Republicans are going to try to use political power to stop the woke
Mm-hmm.
propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And like in the political system, and especially elected offices, are the one place where like the right has
Mm-hmm.
comparable power to the left.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, the left has control of all these other things, but actually that one thing is pretty
Mm-hmm.
important. So
Mm-hmm. So let me just wrap up with this more specific question. All right, we're both professors, we're both in academia, we've got very firsthand evidence on how strong wokeness is on campus. Has woke peaked on campus, or is that going to go up? And like, I assume you know that the next generation of professors is a lot woker than ours.
yeah. Um,
Like, what's going to happen to philosophy? Is philosophy going to get ruined?
I don't know. I mean, the
Probability that
like
philosophy gets ruined and you can no longer just make non-left wing arguments in political philosophy.
yeah, it may be ruined temporarily, right? Like,
For like 100 years will be
like,
ruined.
probably a lot less than that.
50 years.
Maybe, yeah, maybe less of that. I don't
Yeah.
know. I mean,
Just
like
make a prediction that ends after our deaths so we can never be disproven.
yeah, it'll be disproven, but we won't know. Yeah.
For
Um,
us, we can never be disproven.
yeah. Well, so I mean, there's a history of fads in philosophy and in, I don't know, in America, in the
Mm-hmm.
academic world, and like the fads just don't go on that long. It looks to me like some of the wokeness is similar to like the McCarthy era,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, and just like, at some point, at some point the fad passes. And just like
Yeah.
in philosophy, there were things like, oh, there was a fad of logical positivism, there was a
Yeah.
fad of idealism in the 19th
Mm-hmm.
century, and
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Yeah. I mean, a way to call it a fad is prejudging with hindsight because,
Yeah.
well, by definition, a fad is temporary. And like, that's the
Yeah.
question is, was
Yeah.
Christianity a 2,000-year fad? I don't think so. All right. Well, anyway,
Yeah.
thank you very much for the conversation. The book is Progressive Myths. And again, this is a book where, unlike almost anything else in politics, there is no need to agree with the thesis of the author to love the book. Because, as I've told many people, to go and read a Mike Huemer book is not just to learn about the topic, it is to learn the correct way to think about any issue. If thinking can be taught, which is a big if, you can learn it from these books. So thanks a lot for joining us, Mike.
All right. Thanks. It was great talking to you.
All right. Bye bye.